Since we learned about the demand curve already, we've been talking about the substitution effect, we just haven't given it a name. So if you have a price increase, let's say for some reason, then all the substitution effect is saying is that you are buying less of the good that has become relatively more expensive. So in micro, we're always dealing with relative prices because if we're holding everything else equal here when we allow this price to change for this particular good, and so this is always changing relative to everything else. So this is becoming relatively more expensive, and you're just substituting away from things that become relatively more expensive um, and towards things that become relatively cheaper. So there's nothing new there, but then we have the income effect, and for that we have to distinguish between nominal income and real income. And we'll see this distinction a lot more in macro. Nominal just means the dollar amount of income, so whatever your salary is in dollars, that's nominal. And real is in terms of the actual things that you can buy, so your actual purchasing power. So you can think of it as there's a basket of goods that you can afford with your income, and so your income goes up, I can afford more stuff. So later on in macro, when we talk about inflation, then we have to adjust for that. But here we're just talking about one particular good and its price changing. So again, let's think about just some good. I'll just redraw our graph here. That is going up in price for some reason. Doesn't really matter why. And whenever we have a price change like that in micro, whenever we're changing anything on our graph, it's one change at a time. So we're holding everything else equal, including the nominal income that the buyer is, we're talking about one buyer that the buyer is earning here. But one good just got more expensive, so think of that basket of goods that you can afford. Well, I can now afford a little bit less than before because this one good is now more expensive. So my purchasing power is now lower as a result of that. In other words, my real income is a little bit lower. So for a normal good, remember what that means is that if my income is lower, I'm going to buy less of it. So here we're talking about the effect on your real income, right, is lower, which means you buy less, or in other words, your quantity demanded is lower. Right, now remember we're talking about starting with a price change here, so that's why it's a movement along the curve rather than a shift. If I said, you got a raise, so your nominal income was higher, then that would be a demand shift. But we're talking about the price of this good going up and then that affecting your real income. So nominal income staying the same, real income is now slightly lower. Now in most cases this is going to be a very small change. The price of oranges goes up, and but that's just one good out of my entire basket of goods that I can afford with my income. Very small effect, but it's still there. In some cases, maybe it's a good that has a large percentage of your income, so it might be more significant. But generally, we would assume that the substitution effect is still going to dominate here. So, price of an orange goes up. I'm still going to substitute away from oranges, so that probably has a dominant effect on the demand curve. But I might have this tiny effect of my real income being slightly lower, and that also makes me want to buy less of any normal good. So in this case, for a normal good, the substitution effect and income effect are working in the same direction. Now for an inferior good, we have the opposite, where if my real income is going down, then I want to buy more of that good. Right, so in this case, the substitution effect and income effect are working in opposite directions. So the price of this good goes up. I still want to substitute away from a good that became relatively more expensive, but in this case it's inferior. And if I have this change in my real income, it's like I'm a little bit poorer than before, and when I'm poorer, I want to buy more of inferior goods. So I might have this little offsetting effect to that substitution effect, assuming the substitution effect dominates, which we would assume in most cases. So I'm still going to have this downward sloping demand curve, but this now, if it's inferior, the income effect is working in the opposite direction, so it's giving me a slightly offsetting effect where I actually want to buy more of this good because of that income change. And remember, the income change is a result of the price change, so price is going up, real income's going down. I'm a little bit poorer, and when I'm poorer, I want to buy more of inferior goods. So again, working now in the opposite direction of the substitution effect. So that suggests that at least theoretically, we might have a case where we are inferior, and it's actually dominating the substitution effect. In that case, price goes up, and overall, I actually want to buy more of this good. So if that were to happen, it would actually give you an upward sloping demand curve. That's called a Giffen good. And it's really just a theoretical curiosity, so it's not clear whether Giffen goods have ever actually existed. So some examples that people have tried to use is potatoes during the Irish potato famine. Another one might be rice for particular populations. I think in China was an example that was used. But it would have to be a very special case, because it would have to be, remember, prices going up, normally you're looking for substitutes. So if there are any good substitutes, you're not going to really want to buy more of this good when that price goes up, other things being equal. So it would have to be a very unusual circumstance, which is why we don't expect to really find these out in the world. Because it's not like the data can really clearly show you whether something is a Giffen good or not. I suppose I observe that at P1 here, there's a certain quantity, and then price is higher at some other point, and now I have that. I might say, oh, look at that, I just discovered an upward sloping demand curve. But it's more likely that what you're looking at is this. So a downward sloping demand curve, something caused a shift, and now we're over here, we're looking at it at a different time. So you would have to interpret the data, and you really have to rule out everything that might possibly cause a demand shift, which is a lot of different things. And so that's why we would normally assume that something still has a downward sloping demand curve. So that's generally our assumption. That's even why we call it the law of demand, because that's generally our assumption. All you're really assuming is that, other things being equal, price goes up, I want to buy less of it, which seems pretty intuitive, and so it would have to be a very unusual case for that not to hold.